Welcome, everyone. My name's Joe Ferrara. I'm Senior Vice President here at Georgetown, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this event with the novelist and memoirist Hisham Matar. Let me also thank our colleagues at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs for partnering with the President's Office on this gathering. Over nearly 2 decades, Georgetown has sought to deepen opportunities for dialogue at the intersection of faith, culture, and society through this special Faith and Culture series that focuses on distinguished writers and thinkers. Past guests have included the filmmaker Martin Scorsese, novelist Marilynne Robinson, poet Christian Wyman, and just this past fall, author and columnist Andrew Sullivan. This series has been around now for almost 20 years, and from its very beginning in 2008, at the invitation of our former president, Jack DeGioia, Paul Elie, our senior fellow at the Berkley Center, has led this series. Paul is a distinguished author himself. He's the author of The Life You Save May Be Your Own, which was a portrait of 4 20th century Catholic writers. That book won the Penn Martha Allbrand Award for First Nonfiction. He wrote a book after that called Reinventing Bach. Both of those books were finalists for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Paul's most recent book, The Last Supper, which considers the intersection of religion and arts in the 1980s, was published just last spring. And we did an event for that book here. Some of you may have been here for that. Paul's also a regular contributor to The New Yorker on topics such as Catholicism, the Vatican, and Pope Leo. He teaches a fall Ignatius seminar here at Georgetown called The Future of the Catholic Idea, and a spring seminar in the journalism program devoted to literary nonfiction. Today, Paul will guide our conversation with our special guest, Hisham Matar, a London-based author and faculty member at Barnard College in Manhattan. Hisham's work, which has been translated into more than 30 languages, has been recognized around the world for its intimate portrayals of what he calls the human temperament, the deeply personal ways that people respond to circumstances that surround them. His writing is informed by his own experiences. As the son of a prominent Libyan dissident, Jabala Matar, who was abducted and imprisoned when Hisham was just 19 years old, and whose fate nearly 4 decades later remains a mystery. Hisham's search for answers about his father's disappearance is the subject of his Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir, The Return, Fathers, Sons, and the Land in Between, which was published in 2016. The weight of loss, grief, and hope that shapes The Return is a theme across his writings. His debut novel, In the Country of Men, was published in 2006 and won several international awards for its haunting portrayal of a society gripped by authoritarian rule, which the book presents through the eyes of a 9-year-old child. He builds on its themes in his second novel, Anatomy of a Disappearance, which appeared in 2011, and which follows the painful and entangled relationships of a young man with his mother, his stepmother, and most of all, his father, a political dissident who is abducted while living in exile. As the protagonist's journey unfolds in this book, it becomes, as one reviewer described, quote, a life lost inside loss. After finishing The Return, Hisham spent some time in Siena, fulfilling a dream born of his ritual of looking at Sienese paintings in the National Gallery in London. And his moving short book, A Month in Siena, is both a record of his experience there and a reflection on Siena's remarkable fusion of art and civic identity. Hisham's most recent book is My Friends, and that is the book we will focus on today. It centers on 3 Libyan men whose lives overlap in profound ways as they contend with the emotional turmoil of their exile in London. In their friendships, Hisham traces themes that are both deeply personal and also deeply resonant for so many: war, protest, displacement, the search for a life well lived, and above all, the powerful but fragile bonds of family, friendship, and home. Throughout the narrative, my friends moves between personal stories of loss and hope and the collective human experience of political upheaval. Reflecting on the tension between these two scales of time and space, Hisham has shared, and I'll quote, "I think the moment that we are living in is a moment of deep estrangement and uncertainty and fragmentation on so many levels. It seems that the discourse, whether it's on politics or whether it's about humanity and nature, whether it's about questions of intelligence and its authenticity or artificiality, has cast a sort of atmosphere, even for people who have never left their homes and have been afforded the good fortune of living in the same place and with the people that they grew up with, who still feel in some strange way exiled. Since its release in 2024, My Friends has received significant recognition, including as a finalist for a National Book Award and a National Book Critics Circle Award, as well as being a nominee for a Booker Prize. The book also was a recipient of the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction. So, Hisham, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your insights and reflections. We're honored that you're here, and I'm now going to turn it over to Paul Elie to get us started. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thanks to the Office of the President. Thank you, Hisham, for being here. Thanks to all of you for joining us. You asked a few minutes ago, you said you were going to ask me about what I teach, and I teach a whole bunch of different courses, but what I try to convey is that the work I like is happening now. Literature is very much alive. There's new books and new journalism, far more than I could possibly keep up with. So something must be working. And that's my experience in getting to know your work. I was in conversation with Bernard Schwartz in that moment when he was caught between the 92nd Street Y and his current role at the Authors Guild. And I guess you know him?
Yes.
Well, I asked him what he was reading, and he said, well, My Friends. And it was still in proofs, so I got the proof, and I think that was the first book I read, as an electronic proof. And it was just so exciting to go from, I didn't know your work at all. So a friend recommends My Friends, and then I read it, and suddenly I'm in your world, and then through The Return, and then through A Month in Siena, and the wholeness of, it's only 3 books out of, you've got a bunch more, but feeling in the presence of a whole writer really through 3 books, and that's the experience that animates my whole life here at Georgetown. So I'm so glad to have had it kind of happen in real time with your work. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for the fabulous introduction, and thank you all for being here. This incredible room. Are people going to be jumping from this thing? I'm hoping that will. But yes, thank you. And also, it's a personal delight and pleasure to be in conversation with you, Paul. We met, I think, the first time in Rome, and then we met again in Barcelona. And so it's lovely to be back in your base.
Well, I've wanted to have this conversation really ever since that first meeting on a balcony at the Georgetown Villa in Rome, and so here we are. But before we start, will you read something from My Friends just to begin?
Sure, yes. I'm just going to read from the beginning, really. I've always liked this idea of, maybe it never existed, but at least in my mind it did, that there was a moment, just a pre-Renaissance moment, when people wrote books without putting their names on them. That you wrote it for the shelf, out of a sense of gratitude and appreciation for the shelf that has given you all these books. So it's one of the reasons why I like to read from the beginning, because I don't need to introduce it. you could for a moment pretend you don't know what it's called, who wrote it. And with this book, it's not always the case, but with this book, the beginning was really the beginning. It was the first thing that I wrote. And I wrote it, this first paragraph, 8 years or something before I actually started writing it, and carried it in my head. So it's a paragraph that's very intimate to me, without really knowing what it was about. It is, of course, impossible to be certain of what is contained in anyone's chest, least of all one's own, or those we know well, perhaps especially those we know best. But as I stand here on the upper level of King's Cross Station, from where I can monitor my old friend Hisham Matar walking across the concourse, I feel I'm seeing right into him, perceiving him more accurately than ever before, as though all along, during the 2 decades that we have known one another, our friendship has been a study, and now, ironically, just after we have bid one another farewell, his portrait is finally coming into view. And perhaps this is the natural way of things, that when a friendship comes to an inexplicable end, or wanes, or simply dissolves into nothing, the change we experience at that moment seems inevitable, a destiny that was all along approaching, like someone walking toward us from a great distance, recognizable only when it is too late to turn away. No one has ever been a nearer neighbor to my heart. I'm convinced, as I watch him go to his train for Paris, that city where the two of us first met, so long ago and in the most unlikely way, that he is carrying, right where the rib cages meet, an invisible burden, one, I believe, I can discern from this distance. When he still lived here in London, hardly a week would pass without us taking a walk, either through the park or along the river. We sometimes got into a debate, usually concerning an obscure literary question, arguments that, perhaps like all arguments, conceal deeper disagreements. I would sometimes, to my regret, for the gesture has always displeased me, tap my forefinger on his chest and let my palm rest there for a fleeting moment, as though to keep whatever it was that I believed I had placed there stable. And I would once again take note of the distinct pattern of his ribs. The strange way his bones protruded, as if in constant expectation of an attack. I think I'll stop here.
The book is called My Friends, and reading it, I felt, I wouldn't say that I was pondering or understanding friendship for the first time, but certainly in a new way, and what friendship means, especially for people who don't live in their countries of origin. That you've, beyond words like diaspora, that there's a way of creating familiar relations that's present in that book, that the men and women in that book mean something to one another that goes beyond our usual understanding of friendship. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm always amazed by it, it's such a commonplace thing, friendship. But it's really quite amazing how at once promiscuous and resilient it can be. It's promiscuous because we usually have more than one friend at the same time. And it's also promiscuous because we know that the best way to kill a friendship is to dictate to it, Like you and I sit down and say, so here's the kind of friends we're going to be. It's not going to work that way. So involved in it is some kind of hope or promise in experimentation, And let's see what happens here. What kind of friends we will be. And we also understand on some level, I'm talking, of course, about really deep friendships, not Facebook friendships. But, there's also an acknowledgement that part of what we're enthused by is that we acknowledge on some level that we're involved in a work in progress. In other words, that the friendship we will make together will be unlike any other friendship, because it will be made by what happens between us. And also I find what's remarkable about it is that then, given all of that, there's no vow, really. There's no promise. It's not like, till death does us part. It's not, who knows what will happen. And we have been involved in friendships where, for whatever reason we don't quite understand, they fizzle away, and it's very painful. But also, I hope, it's been the case for everyone in the room, that you are involved in friendships where you underestimated what might occur here, or just didn't really think that you would go to those depths and you'd be so connected in such a profound way. So I'm obviously, as personally, very sustained by them and curious about them, but also beyond myself, as a social structure, it's really quite remarkable. Yeah. I didn't think when I was writing this book that I was writing in praise of. I didn't think that, praise of friendship. I just thought I was just guided by this opening page and thinking about the ways that friendship has surprised me, in many ways. So yeah.
One of the friendships in the novel, two young men are involved in an incident at the Libyan embassy in 1984. And this is an incident that figures as fact into the return. At what point did you decide that you were going to make a fiction around this, and was it friendship first, or shooting at the embassy first, or?
No, I literally wrote that first paragraph, and I felt it so deeply, And this is a bad habit. I really genuinely think I should stop doing this, but I persist in this with this brutal policy, which is that when I write something I like, I deliberately want to forget it. It's as though like throwing some child in the deep end and seeing if they survive. See, I'm just going to try to forget it. So I had this sentence. It is of course impossible to be certain of what is contained in anyone's chest, least of all one's own. I had this whole paragraph in my head. And from time to time I would think about it and I'd be moved by it. And often books start like that for me, that it's sort of a feeling or an attitude, a voice, a quality of being. I thought, before I started writing, that people sat down to write books when they had all the words. And I found out, actually, no. You sit down to write exactly when you can't find the words. You don't know what the words. But something else has matured, a state, or what maybe, it's not a very good way of putting it, but maybe you sort of describe as a quality of being in the world. And you want to capture it in language, and that's where the enthusiasm comes, And so the first paragraph, and then I thought, what would be the next sentence? And then the sentence, then the one after that in a paragraph, suddenly you've got 2 pages. It's clear to me from the way that he's speaking that this farewell is a real transformative moment for him. Something really shifts in him. His best friend is leaving for forever, moving away, and he's left alone in the city. And so I knew at that moment that he will decide to walk home. And I thought, wouldn't that be interesting to tell the whole book on this walk, from St. Pancras Station to Shepherd's Bush, and then see what happens in the walk. And it was really like that. I was walking with him. I tried, I tested him doing the other things. For a moment I thought maybe he'd meet someone. Maybe he'd speak to someone, either on the phone or meet someone in the street that he knows. And none of that worked. So the whole walk is really him on his own. And one of the things that I was thinking about is how the texture of time itself changes in certain moments. Most of the time it's just sort of, it's like polished marble. Everything skids off and you forget everything. And then there are certain moments, and it's not always obvious what has provoked them. Quality of light, a certain feeling you have, a moment in the day opens up, and it could last even for seconds or minutes. That feels really porous, like so much can go into that moment, and you feel a sense of a slightly shifting difference of possibilities. Cognitively, sentimentally, intellectually, emotionally, just something shifts a little bit. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have the whole novel sit in that moment, where Khalid, the narrator, is really suddenly able to catch in the net of this walk so much of what has happened between the friends. But to your specific question about the shooting in St. James's Square, that's such a profound, such a big event in at least Libyans of my generation. It's just such a memorable moment, I was 13 when it happened. Saw it on television. A family was gathered, everybody, lunch, something like that. And the television was on, and suddenly this thing appeared. Shooting, demonstration in front of the Libyan embassy in 1984, April. And from the embassy, they opened, there's three people inside the embassy open the window, and they spray the demonstrators. They kill...
machine gun spray, right?
Yeah. They kill WPC Yvonne Fletcher, as a young policewoman working that day, and they wound 11 demonstrators. And I was 13, and I was really affected by it. I found it so powerful. It lasted only for a few seconds, but I remember this very powerful detail of the demonstrators when those who were shot, when they fell on the ground, they were screaming in agony, And one in particular really caught my attention because he would scream, and then very quietly he would call for his mother. And then he'd scream some more, shout and curse, and then call for his mother very gently. And then I thought, maybe I've misheard this, because all this, very quickly was happening. And one of the adults in the room, I think it was my uncle or something, said, I think I just heard him call for his mother, And it just stayed with me that, I don't know, maybe because as a 13-year-old, you carry the fantasy that one day you will not need your mother. It turns out you'll always need your mother, So, and so that, and then, as life moves on, you forget about it. Other things happen. I went to London, I went to university. I started meeting people who had been at that demonstration and learning things about it, not deliberately. I almost never asked questions, Everything I learned was just happened over a long period of time by people that I knew very well, who are not these characters, but I learned a lot about that event through that. And so when Khalid in his walk, as I am writing and walking with him, as it were, enters St. James's Square, I panic. The writer panics. I think I can't do this.
You weren't planning to write about it.
I wasn't planning
but
to.
But when the character reaches
yeah,
the site that is loaded with memory,
yeah,
an obligation is put on you.
Yeah. I just thought I don't really know what to. But also, it's always curious to me how there are these two responses as you're writing. There's the sort of socially responsible, you like to think very tactful human being, thoughtful to others, etc. But there's also the ruthless writer who just kind of proceeds, carries on writing. And so I carried on after a pause of a few weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. I just stopped writing when I got to St. James's Square. And then I started again. And then I started talking to particularly one friend who was wounded on that day. And he was so generous with telling me all the details. And he wasn't troubled by me writing about it. He didn't feel like you shouldn't. Or he encouraged me. And he did me really a great act of generosity because he enjoyed exactly the thing that I was worried about. That I took things that had happened to him. So the wound that Khalid has in his lungs is the exact same one that my friend suffered. But my friend was grateful to me for taking what happened to him and making something else of it. So I have this other character with other thoughts, other sensibilities. My friend is not Khalid. So this book owes a lot to that, really. I learned a lot from my friend in that way. Maybe learned isn't just the thing, because I knew a lot of the things that he was telling me, but it was more, I felt released by him, you know. I felt permitted somehow. That was really wonderful.
So in that book, these characters keep going back to the episode in 1984 at the embassy. And in writing The Return, you had to go back again and again to certain moments in your father's life, often unknown ones, at things that happened at the prison, for example, where he was kept for no one knows how long. But then you describe in A Month in Siena, finishing The Return and going to Siena, where you've wanted to go because you have this strong attachment to Sienese painting, and of being, and this is my interpretation now, after spending a lot of imaginative life in the past, you're in Siena and you feel held in the present for an entire month. And that was a totally different experience, the way you related anyway. Can you describe what it was like to be in this, to be held by Siena in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I like to think everybody is in a better situation, but I always feel slightly to one side of time. You know, I always feel slightly behind or ahead, or there are a few moments when I'm really in time, and they're usually, you know, very, I don't know, moments of delight when you're with the people you love, or when you're in the sea and you know that there's this great dinner waiting for you. Something like that, you know. So, but most of the time, that doesn't last long, you know. Most of the time, there's other stuff that's where sometimes you end up feeling a little detained by this and that's so as we can do this, you know. But Siena was very unusual. It was the whole month. Imagine a whole month of feeling really in time, and it was for me an important moment, because I just finished The Return, which was a book that really I feel it came out of my veins. You know, it was very difficult writing it and thrilling. You know, it's a strange experience, because when I was in the material and I was working, I was filled with the vitality of the challenges of the book. You know, I really think, you know, the book you write is your fate, really. You don't really choose it on some level. Maybe you could choose not to do it, but it doesn't appear to me that there's a whole set of choices that I'm making, you know? So I really feel the book really becomes a real presence in my life, and it puts certain obligations on me, you know, for a number of years. And with The Return, it felt like this really strong horse, you know. When I was very little, I used to ride horses. I loved riding horses so much that I would wake up early before school to go ride and then go to school. And sometimes you'd get to this is in Cairo, and sometimes you get to the stable, and the horse that you normally ride is either not well or somebody else took it, and you get these horses that are just massive and really, like, they are for very experienced riders. And you know when you're on that horse that you should just not, you know, try to impose yourself here. You know, just if they want to go left, go left. Don't argue, you know. So and the book had that sort of sense, you know, of real power in it, and I felt complimented by it. You know, I felt like it was. I always didn't feel. I wasn't sure I could quite keep up. You know. It was really wonderful on that level. But then it was pulling me into these areas that were very, very difficult to be in. And because of its register, it was asking me to be incredibly patient with things that make me very impatient. And it was requiring something that I found so interesting artistically, but also outside of that, something to do with mind and spirit, or it was asking me to apply a kind of tender fierceness to exactly the thing that I wanted to run away from. So, as an example, what were the moments like when my father was kidnapped, blindfolded, put on an airplane, and he was flying to Libya? What was that moment like for him? Of course, I mean, any sane person should not think about this. Should do something else. That's not what you want to do. Go do something. Go play tennis. But the book was. It showed me that if I applied this, what I'm calling tender fierceness, what happens, and if you could bear it, if you could just pause and bear it. Don't go with a sharp instrument, but don't run. Just stay. The material starts to sort of become elaborate. It starts to open up in some way. And that was something really fascinating. So the book had all of these pleasures, but also it was very painful. And so when I was done with it, there were moments in the middle of the book when I thought I might not be able to. This will either finish me or I'll finish it. And so when I was done, I felt the sense of exhilaration and release, and I wanted to do something pleasurable. And so Siena was that. It was sort of, I thought I was just going there because of the paintings and for the pleasure of it, and to allow myself something that I've never done, which is stop working for a month, And but then, of course, I discovered something else happens, as you know. Something else happens in Siena that is connected to all of this, that I didn't maybe know consciously when I was going there, but as I was there, it started to occur. But I won't spoil it for you because it's also not something to talk about. Really. There are some things to write, and that you can't talk about.
You have this practice. It runs through the 3 books we're discussing today. Going to a museum and spending some time in front of a painting, often the same painting for several months, for an hour a day.
Yeah, well, not quite an hour. No, it's not that bad. No, maybe 20 minutes.
It's incredible to read about, and I just wanted to do it more.
Yeah.
But where did that come from, and what does it mean to you that you have this long look that's a big part of your life?
I think there's, very little is more generous than a great work of art. It's just constantly giving, and it's generous in both senses of the word, giving, but also it's generative. It sort of, it inspires emotions and ideas and conversations. So it does feel a bit like a conversation. And the short answer is that it just gives me pleasure. It gives me pleasure. And I look at the painting, and I stop when I've exhausted my interest, or I've become bored or distracted. I have no real method. In the early days, it was when I was 19, and it also started around the time when my father was kidnapped. So it was
There's an extraordinary episode in The Return about the painting you were looking at on a bad day for him, right?
Yeah. So sometimes it used to be a week, then it was a month, now it's longer. I think because I'm slower, but it's just longer. It takes longer. 6 months, a year, sometimes 2 years. But it's not that I'm not looking at anything else at that time. But that painting becomes a location in my life, really, a mental and physical location, a real place that I go to, and I deposit my curiosities, my attention. This is what, I think there's something that happens with paintings that is impossible to prove or measure. But I think that, a great painting retains some element, some trace of all of the people that have looked at it. So it's not a passive agent that's just sitting on the wall. It's also absorbing so much across time, and and all of that is just there. You know, you can go into the National Gallery in DC. Can you imagine how lucky we are? You can just go into and just look. It's there, and it's got all of this. It's got everything: ideas, pleasure, aesthetics, delight. So I know it's just something I'm interested in, and I like it.
It's interesting that you described the painting as giving, and I think that's very powerful. But my own impression, reading your accounts of your time spent with paintings, especially in a month in Siena, is how much I feel a whole person present before the painting that you're describing. You're not an art critic or a man with a Baedeker who's passing through Siena. We were talking about the passage about the painting, the Madonna of the Franciscans in the book.
Yeah.
Can you read that passage?
Yes. Yeah.
Which, for me, I just felt present with the whole, all of you right there in front of that painting.
It's such a wonderful picture, that. Okay, so these are very old paintings. They're not cool. They're not cool. In other words, when I was
at Georgetown, maybe they're cool.
when I was in my late teens, early 20s, those weren't the paintings that you went to. You went to Cézanne or Velázquez or something. But they were a secret passion. It's because they weren't cool, or I didn't think they were cool. I didn't mention them to anyone. So they were a secret passion, and for all these years, I avoided Siena. I go to Italy regularly, and I've never been to Siena until 2016 when I go for this month. After my first excited and somewhat bewildered tour of the Pinacoteca, I spent the following few days mostly looking at the Madonna dei Francescani, a painting that is the size of a private letter. It is thought that Duccio painted it sometime around 1290, when he was yet to become the master of the city. All I wanted now was to be with this earlier, humbler miniature, in which the Virgin Mother's dark gown carves a sort of secondary domain in the middle space, as though she were a doorway onto another reality, or else unveiling a private space, one containing the very quality of her existence, its desolate vulnerability, which is contrasted here with the strength of her great son, who, although still a child, is already aware of the weight and power of his being. The three Franciscan friars at the Virgin's feet appear as one man caught in motion, descending from a position of prayer to kiss Mary's foot, like an early slow-motion film. The child, like all children, has already been initiated into the language of punishment and forgiveness. He understands the friar's plea for mercy and his mother's good ability to give it. And the mother, who can read her son's thoughts, is fortified and persuaded by his verdict. This unites the pair in a reciprocal scheme. They are seduced by one another's dominance. This, together with their languid repose, set so starkly against the friar's urgent appeal, makes them seem even more confident and authoritative. But the whole plot is undercut by Duccio's sly suggestion, which he introduces through the arid stillness of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, that there is something mildly premeditated about the two. They believe that they know more than most, or perhaps more than all, about the transactional power of blessings. And this, strangely, confines them to their fate. Predestiny here is not so much a theological as a psychological condition. I wondered how I would have looked at this painting had I been Christian. Perhaps I would have liked it less, or liked it more, or liked it in a way that was beside the point, to do with its religious symbolism, and I would have then thought that that was the point, that that was why it had sustained my interest. And I might have been moved and delighted in a subtle but profoundly different way. Or, then again, if I had been a Christian who had outgrown or for whatever reason turned away from my faith, it might have irritated me, brought back bad memories, reminded me of what I would rather forget. It might then have seemed to belong to the oppressive system that I had denounced or simply left behind in the way modern people do, dusting religion off their shoulders without much ceremony and without even the need not to believe. In this scenario, the painting would have surely come with its own catalogue of other images and smells and voices, perhaps even the faces and hands of people I had grown up knowing. And if this were the case, how peculiar it would have seemed that such a person as myself, coming from a different tradition, should be so absorbed by these pictures as to leave his wife and home to do little else apart from look at them in the city where he knew no one. I might have then seen it within the competitive language of sibling faiths as confirmation of my truth. By the same token, a Muslim might have thought it suspicious, perhaps even disloyal, that I would be so taken by such iconography. To be from one of the Abrahamic faiths, to have been born into one and come of age in the culture of another, and in this time that has for so long now been interested in the confrontation of these traditions, often too concerned with narrow distinctions, with condemnations and ill-motivated comparisons, with the logic of discrimination and the lexicon of fear, as though the point of history were to prove ourselves correct, more God-loving, more true, or more human, as though spirituality were not the private realm of the heart, but rather a race to the finish line, where a smiling God would hand out the medals. All this, as I stood in the Pinacoteca, seemed beside the point. The interesting thing is that all the while I looked at the Madonna di Francescani, none of these things occurred to me. Instead, I was the mother, the child, and the friar. I felt the painting was painted specifically for me, and as though by a brother, not only because Duccio, like all men and women, is a fellow human being, but also because it was obvious to me that he did not intend his picture to be approached from a place of affiliation or allegiance, but rather from the simple position of being human. This is an essential part of the power of the Madonna di Francescani. It is far more interested in human life than it is in God.
Born into one Abrahamic faith and come of age in the culture of another.
Yeah.
That's the way, inter alia, you characterize yourself in that passage. And is that, the passage and your work in general, it's so far either above or apart or beyond questions of identity in the way that they're usually framed.
Yeah.
Is that it? And I think you could hear it in the passage, that you seem to, it's not from any point of simple identification that you see that painting. Yeah. Is that intentional, or is that an effort on your part, or is that just an outcome of the way your life has gone, that you seem to, you're born into one faith and come of age in the culture of another, and drawing from both of them, or?
Yes, I my experience is is one where there is so much. I mean, it's also, I think, objectively true, right? I mean, I think the interesting thing about your question is what it says about our time rather than what it said about my gesture, right? Because I think historically it's so, and in contemporary sense, it's so, to me, they're very connected, you know. I don't know, it's very hard to speak about these things, but I'm now thinking about why it's hard to speak about these things. And one of the reasons why it's hard, because you notice suddenly there are all these political temptations to make a point, you know, given the absurdity of the political discourse, you know, to make a point about this or that. And you know, as much as I want to, I also don't want to be distracted, because I think part of the challenge of resistance is also not being distracted by the language, by the logic, by the terms set up for you, you know? But to proceed from the terms that you acknowledge to be more interesting. And for me, it's you know, I have such a love for Islam, and I'm very moved by it. You know, I'm very, very moved by my faith. You know, or by the complexities of it. You know, and so from that standpoint, when I go and look at Duccio, also this is a moving feast. You know, at that moment, this is what I felt. I feel something corresponding now, but also what I don't write about there is that the Virgin Mary is a very significant figure for me as a Muslim. You know, of course, she's so important. And my relationship to the music of Bach. We spoke about Bach and about Christian music and architecture and art. I don't go to them and feel, oh, this is some foreign tradition. You know, I do feel that there's this shared bedrock, you know, of and what fascinates me is also how the different traditions come at certain theological points and questions. So this is a very bad way of saying that to me this whole area is an area filled with excitement and joy and complexity. And I don't look at it and think, oh, you know, that's why I really lament the current discourse. I lament it. I think it's stupid. Ultimately, it's stupid, you know, and deeply prejudicial. And I think it dispossesses us of the far more interesting truth, you know, of the history of these traditions. Yeah.
It's a beautiful passage, and I just was in awe reading it for the first time and just hearing it again. We're going to go to questions from the audience, but I'll pose one that was raised by a student in class an hour ago, which is, he wrote The Return. Time has passed. Some things have changed and some things haven't changed. And what would you say if you were writing an epilogue to The Return now about the situation in Libya and your own relationship to the place?
That's a very big question. I mean, if I focus just on what's going on in Libya, I think that's fairly it's a very bad situation because although it's stable, so I feel with Libya, the problem is also what's good is also what's bad. So what's good is that it's relatively speaking stable. There are skirmishes, but relatively speaking, generally safe. But what that means is that the different groups that control different parts of the country are themselves become more entrenched, and the roots have dug deeper. So any project to try to sort of unite the country under a single government becomes more challenging. Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being here, Hisham.
Pleasure.
So other than your relationship with your father, the one personal relationship to me that stood out from your works is your relationship with Diana.
Yeah.
And even in A Month in Siena, one of the lasting impressions I got from that book was how you described getting used to her absence after she left a few days after you arrived there. And I somehow felt like her lingering presence throughout the rest of the book. I think you talked about almost feeling jealous of the gazes that she would be making without you, the memories she would be making without you. So I was wondering if you have plans to write a book that's focused on that relationship and how that has impacted your life, just given how your personal history has motivated so much of your other works.
No, I don't have plans, but I think The Month in Siena is really not really about Siena. It's not really about Siena or the paintings as much as it is about Diana in some way. But yeah, no plans. But that's not unusual. I make no plans. I'm writing the book I'm writing now, and I will see. But thank you for your question. Yeah.
Are you far along on a new work?
It's bad. It's bad to talk about it.
Next question.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Hello.
It's lovely hearing you speak. I'd like to ask you, what's the relationship between fiction and reality in your work? Because it seems you lean a lot on personal experience and real stuff that happened historically, but at the same time, you do present fictional work. So I'd like to hear how you navigate that.
Yeah, I think the distinction is it's not clear to me whether it's helpful. Because I understand that we need it for the library, right? But in writing, I think what I write is works of the imagination. I don't know why I have to call it one thing or the other. But I think that the form of the novel is really where I feel myself situated in some way. And so even with The Return and A Month in Siena, they're not novels, clearly, but the way they move, their structure, their form, I feel, is in my mind akin to a novel. But I think what you mean is more to do with sort of the relationship between what I'm making up and what I know, right? And when I wrote The Return, and more The Return than Siena, just because of the nature of the book, I was very rigorous about accounts. If somebody says something, I'm double check, triple check with them, that I got it right, and so on. So there was this sense that I was, as well as making a work of the imagination, I was also attending to a kind of historical document of some sort, right? So, but apart from that, I felt even with The Return, and even when I was doing that, if I say to you, tell me what you did yesterday evening, you are going to make it up, even if you're not making it up, even if you're being really honest and wanting to give me an accurate account. You, by definition, your imagination will immediately get involved to recount things, to edit out other details that you don't think would interest me, and you're going to focus on. So this to me has just grown and grown and grown, this very commonplace event of the imagination constantly getting involved, But yeah, something like that, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you for coming out. My name is Namata, and I'm a grad student here at Georgetown. And you made a statement that resonated with me. You said sometimes it's easier to write things down than to talk about it. And I find the same thing too, because when I write things down, I feel like more free. And when I talk about certain things, emotion just comes up. So I was just asking, can you give an example? What is easier for you to write down than speak about it? If you can just give some example of some topics.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. It's not, what I meant is that it's not easier. It's more that it's just not possible. You know, there are certain things that it's possible to try to write about them. But I find them, at least in my day-to-day life, much more difficult to talk about. And not difficult to talk about because I'm overcome with emotion or I am... It's not necessarily that. It's just that I think that prose on the page has a kind of facility that speech doesn't. Not always, and the tensions between the two have always fascinated me, you know. But speech has a kind of momentum and a connection to a physical presence of someone else. Everything we're saying is being co-authored by whoever else is in the room. Like everything I've told you today is partly you guys made me do it. You know, the quality of your presence. You know, this is what I find this very interesting. Things like this, because you notice that there is a different quality to the conversation. And the only thing that would explain it for me is what's happening between all of us, even though I'm doing too much talking. But, you know, what's happening. So I think conversation has that lovely collaborative, very difficult to measure, but a collaborative measure. But prose, there's you know, writing is maybe it's to do with that solitary nature that you can really begin to move towards something that needs a kind of pace that isn't available. I mean, just like the piece I just read you about Madonna di Francescani and the thoughts around it, I wouldn't have been able to say these things standing in front of the painting with, you know, my dearest, you know, companion. You know, I would have said something else. It might be better. I don't know. You know, but there's a register to the writing that only happens, I think, in the writing. And I have a fascination in that, in the line of it, you know, in actually writing the line itself and what it does to time. To be locked into time in that way is a different form of expression than typing or speaking or texting, or, you know, it's there's something about that I think is to do with the subject. But yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Pleasure.
I was thinking, or I wanted to know about how Arabic figures into. You talked about having like a story or a paragraph or a sentence in your head,
Yeah.
and then you told us you recounted the events at the Libyan embassy, and I immediately thought of someone calling for their mother in Arabic because
Yeah.
of the way you described it.
Yeah.
And it just made me wonder, how does Arabic, I know you write in English, but is Arabic part of how you're conceiving of these stories sometimes? And do you work with translators closely when it's translated into Arabic? Maybe that's a second question.
Yeah.
But just interested about the relationship to Arabic, both in your conceptualizing and, yeah.
Yeah. That's a very rich subject, and it's not stable for me. It's always shifting. But in the early days when I started writing, it was a real burning problem that I wanted to consolidate to someone. I felt that there was something that needed to be bridged. There was some fault. Some history had cracked, you know, the foundations in some sense. And I found that really problematic. And then with time, it stopped being such a problem. I began to be more curious than troubled by it. that I had very powerful relationship to Arabic up to the age of 11. Very, very, I know I was very young, but I was really, really had a very, very powerful love affair with the language. I wrote in it. I spoke like an 80-year-old man. And soliloquies, just go on and on. Maybe I'm glad that's over now. And then suddenly the switch that was decided by circumstances, it wasn't my choice at all. And but then I was, in order for me to keep up with the studies, I was pickled in English. It's like pickled in it. So everything around me was suddenly English. And a passion began to grow with the language, So I do have also a love affair, very passionate love affair with the language. So right now I write in English, I hear it in English, but in conversations with Arabic, something happens that is not always available in English. In song, where it really gets me is in song, If I listen to Nasser al-Mizdawi, for example, this wonderful Libyan songwriter, nothing breaks my heart more than listening to Nasser al-Mizdawi. So things like that. And but I've recently translated a book of dreams by Naguib Mahfouz. Kept a dream diary, which I've always found interesting. And my wife Diana and I met him around the year 2000. We had a very powerful, wonderful encounter with Naguib Mahfouz, who was as talented as he was kind and smart and really, really lovely human being and funny. He had been stabbed not long before this, and so Naguib Mahfouz was like Kierkegaard. You could measure your time with his movements. Goes from this cafe to this cafe to this cafe, and then suddenly somebody comes and stabs him in the neck. He puts his hand over his neck and walks to the story goes, walks to the hospital and waits in line.
And he's in his 80s
That
already,
was Naguib Mahfouz, like waiting in line. The nurse comes, is everything okay? He goes, no, I'm sure it's nothing really. He goes like this. And after that, his health really suffered. And the combination of fear of being attacked again and his waning health, he started to hold these secret soirees. So a friend of my father's would go to these soirees. So he said to Diana and I on a visit to Cairo, he said, do you guys want to come and meet? Of course we want to go. So we went, and I hadn't published anything. I didn't, and yet, when he saw me walking, he stood up and walked with his cane and his assistant, to the door, and they're all shouting because he's hard of hearing. Shouting. It's very funny and he enjoyed the fact that he could speak very softly. So they'd be shouting, and he would just speak very softly. So, Hisham Matar, Libyan writer. And so he gave his cane to his assistant, and he put out his hands to me, and he said, Libyan? So I nodded. I didn't want to scream, so I nodded. And then he said, with or against? I said, against. He says, very good, come sit next to me. And we had this wonderful, wonderful evening. So the book is, I translate the dreams. I write an introduction about this encounter and about his work, and the dreams are very interesting. So many wonderful motifs. And Diana was photographing in Cairo for some 7 years, and it was started around that time, and so we put also photographs that work really well with the... Anyway, so this is me translating, and I work very closely with my Arabic translator. I have a wonderful Arabic translator. But I always feel not very helpful. And I always thought, with my first book, when I thought it was going to be translated to Arabic, I remember meeting my then translator, a wonderful Egyptian novelist called Muhammad Abdel Nabi. And we met at Groppi, which is this cafe in the heart of the city, and it's really good coffee, and they forget about you. You could be there all day. So we went to look at the manuscript. And I was so excited. I felt this would be like the moment of consolidating my two voices, and it will return. The book will return to its mother tongue. Anything but I discovered I am an English language writer. My ear wasn't, and I really found it painful. Those 4 hours were so painful, very difficult. So, yeah.
Is there one more question?
Yes. There's someone here.
Hi, Hisham. As a fellow Libyan, I'm honored to be speaking with you right now. I wanted to ask you about how a common theme in a lot of your books is grief and loss, and I wanted to know how has that evolved over time for you and your relationship with those themes?
That's such a good question. It's a friend of mine asked me recently. I was surprised. A very close friend. One of those friends that you only, because of circumstances. We speak maybe 3-4 times a year. But when we speak, it's as though we're right into the depths straight away. And so he just said to me, he said, so where are you? I said, oh, I'm here in New York. He said, no, where are you? Where are you with this question? Still looking for your father, have you? What? I said, yeah, we're still looking. Every time they find a mass grave, we do the DNA tests. And he says, yeah, but where are you? Where are you with it? And it was really interesting because he asked me, and it allowed me to catch up with myself. Because it turns out I'd been sort of making silent work, and it's a real surprise for me. Because I was always, there's this paradigm of do you forgive, do you not forgive? And I think it's the wrong paradigm, for me at least. It's a very big subject, this, for us to really speak about it in detail. But I've arrived at something else that is, over dinner we need to have a theological conversation, because I'm looking for the English word for it, because I can't find the right English word for it. But in Islam there's a concept where you تسلم أمرك لله, يعني you not exactly resign your pain or your concern to God. It's not resign, it's not surrender, it's something else. It's almost, to put it in a secular sense, kind of trusting nature and time, but not so as justice will be. It's not karma, at least karma in the way that we use it in the West. Like, okay, they will get their punishment. It's not even that. It's not even involved in that. That's what I find so interesting about it. It's not involved in that paradigm. I've never in my life hungered for revenge. It's never been. I don't see. That's not going to put out the fire for me. It seems like I think revenge is a distraction. So when my friend asked me that, I discovered I had been making work. But this is really difficult to talk about it in any thoughtful way quickly. But so it's something like that. Thank you. There was someone here. She had her hand up for a while, and yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I consider you also my teacher in terms of my knowledge about Libya and even Siena, so I'm very grateful that you're here. And my question to you is about your mother. You talk about her in The Return, and I'm a PhD candidate here in the history department, and I work on the history of the Palestinian revolution in the 60s and the 70s. And mothers, of course, in Palestinian history are very much, foundational to poets and writers, and they all talk about, how foundational their mothers were, not just in shaping their political imagination and understanding, but in crafting even their literary knowledge. So they discovered that, they have talents, and, even Ghassan Kanafani mentions his sister Faiza as the person who got him pens and, encouraged that. So women are clearly present in your trajectory
Very
and in your
much,
novels,
yeah.
and they're strong as
Yeah,
well. So I was, hoping you can talk
Yeah,
about
no,
that
I'm
relationship.
I'm really glad you asked me that because of what happened to my father. People, of course, for all the right reasons, ask me about my father, or there's the impression that I'm my father's son, and I hope I am my father. In that sense, of course, I'm very, very proud of my father. But I've always felt I'm much more my mother's son. In the sense of learning quite a lot from her, and of course, I've had the good grace of having her for much longer, and she's very, very present. And it's also interesting that you should ask me this because I spent this week teaching Kanafani, and there's this photograph, I'm sure you know it. It's one of my favorite photographs of Kanafani, where he's sitting working away at the desk, and his mother is sitting there, and she's sort of looking towards him. And I've always loved that photograph because he's there. Kanafani was a writer who was really very interesting for so many reasons, but one of the things that I find fascinating about him is that he was, in some ways, similar to Virginia Woolf, thinking about how do you not be distracted? How do you, in other words, make the work? Resist, but also dream, And Virginia Woolf was thinking about this question a lot. I mean, in A Room of One's Own, I feel is a very pertinent essay right now for us all in that sense, because in that essay she asks a set of questions, and one of them is, she wants to think about how the life of women and fiction. She's been asked to speak on the subject, so she goes to Oxbridge, she goes to the colleges, she goes to there's lots of meals in the essay, there's lots of lunches and so on, and she's like all these look how rich these colleges are. They're all men. College, the food is amazing, wine, all this money. And it gets to her, this question. And she can't go to the library unchaperoned, So she has a stark example of how male power has dominated learning. She gets fed up. She goes to London. She goes to the reading room in London. Wants to read about women writing about the creative life. She can't find anything. She finds a lot of stuff written by men. Men seem to have no hesitation to write endlessly about women, and she notices something in their tone. She notices this thing. It's like contempt, this tone of contempt, and it really gets. It becomes the center of the essay. This question: why do they have this tone of contempt? She goes to have lunch. She buys a newspaper written by men. Parliament, this is 1929, Parliament is almost all men. And again, she finds the same tone. And it really becomes, why? And she won't settle for the easy answers. Men don't like women, they don't think women are smart. But then she comes up with this, I think, brilliant answer. And it's very pertinent to us now, which is she says, men write about women in that way because deep down they know that their advantage is accidental. So it becomes, and Kanafani was involved in a completely different circumstances, was involved in something like this. He was also the subject of contempt, he and his people, and he was also wanting to resist and resisted very honorably, but also he was an artist. So having his mother there, I always thought, here he is dreaming, and his mother, the mother with all of what she contains. But for me, personally, they are really the ones, they're why I write, I was brought up by women, and they were the ones that had the stories memorized, lots of, the Arabian Nights particularly. And I was with them all the time. My mom, my aunts, I was with them all the time. And then there comes that tragic moment around 6, 7, when they discover, he's not just, he's not neutral. He's a boy. When we take him to the baths, his eyes are lingering a bit too long on that woman's breast. So and then suddenly you're given over to the men. And it's, for me, it was a tragic moment because they're boring, they're silent, they're austere. They took me hunting. That was that to break me in. Took me hunting, shooting all this innocent deer, bringing it back, deer on top of the Range Rover, you know, with their tongues hanging out.
And it's never been the same.
It's never been the same. I've been trying to recover ever since. No, it's you know, my mother is one of those. Talking about my mother would be one of those things that would be. I would always be incomplete talking about her. You know. Yeah.
This is really fantastically rich, and to hear the laughter amidst all the other emotions is really powerful. Let's continue the conversation over in the next room.
Thank you.
We have your books for signing.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you again, Joe Ferrara.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thanks so much.